Welcome to video 3 from chapter 6. We will look at body growth and changes. So let's begin with the fact that body proportions change from infancy through childhood. I'm going to give you a few facts here that aren't listed on the slide, but first of all, the baby's head is very large compared to the rest of the body, particularly at birth. I mean, if you look at a newborn, their heads look huge. Because remember, I talked in the last chapter, I talked about the cephalocaudal direction of development from head to tail, or meaning top to bottom. So this started prenatally, that the head was developing more rapidly than the rest of the body, and so it's very noticeable at birth that the baby's head takes up far greater proportion of its overall length compared to like an adult human. The trunk and the limbs will catch up in early childhood during the early childhood growth that goes on. So for at least for the first few years, the head's going to be out of proportion. There are gender differences in the level of body fat, but they're very small in infancy, and also small during the rest of childhood. We tend to kind of have a stereotype of males being more rugged and muscular, and girls being softer, but throughout most of infancy, early childhood, and the elementary school years, the differences are actually quite small. As a 6-year-old girl many 6-year-old girls could beat up many 6-year-old boys, or they could play sports just as well as the boys do. I mean, there's not a large difference with fat, compared to muscle between the genders until you reach puberty. It becomes larger. The difference between males and females, starts to become larger in adolescence. Girls accumulate more body fat than boys do following puberty. Boys gain more muscle compared to body fat, compared to girls following puberty. So, that's when you really start to see, a distinction. And because we see it in adolescence, and we also see it in adulthood, that, a typical male will have more muscles than a typical female, and typical female has more fat than typical male, but in like early adulthood. But once again, during childhood, very small differences. We tend to kind of mentally exaggerate the differences in our minds. I'm going to go on to the next slide and keep giving some growth facts. So growth from birth to age 2 is very, very rapid. This is the most rapid time of development, the first couple of years of life. Think about it. I mean, think about what a newborn looks like. So you can hold a newborn in one hand, and compared to a 2-year-old that's running around and jumping in puddles, and they feel heavy to carry. And I mean, you had that 2 years earlier, you were holding them in one hand, and they were light as air, and now at 2, I mean, what a difference. I mean, so the first 2 years more rapid than any other time of life, including puberty. Birth weight doubles by about 5 months after birth. It triples typically by the first. These are like typical patterns. So it doubles by 5 months, following birth. It triples by the first birthday. The infant gains 10 years in the first 2 years of life on average. 10 inches, excuse me. The infant gains 10 inches in the first 2 years of life. In early childhood years, which when I say early childhood, that means the preschool years, like 3 to 5, Their growth slows and becomes more steady compared to those first 2 years of rapid growth. It slows down now in early childhood. And, the arms and length, the arms and legs start to lengthen, as it says on the screen here. This is during early childhood, while the head becomes more in proportion. So preschoolers, the preschool ages. I mean, when they're still like seem out of proportion at 2, but by the time they get up to about 5, I mean, or they get to kindergarten, I mean, like they're looking more like in proportion. They're not quite all the way there, compared to an adult human, but they don't look like they're out of proportion anymore. I mean, um, if you think about toddlers, I mean, what do you notice? Their legs seem so short, right? I mean, think again of that cephalocaudal pattern of development. Their arms, as it says here, arms and legs lengthen, but the arms tend to go first. They're higher up. It's top to bottom. So their arms start to lengthen more, and so you kind of go through this phase where their torso and their arms kind of seem in proportion with their head, but their legs still seem too short for their body, and then the legs kind of catch up during early childhood. In middle childhood means the elementary school years. Children grow an average of about 2 inches per year, and they gain about 6.5 pounds per year. It's fairly, consistent, steady growth. Now, obviously, when I say things like that, you know that there are going to be weird patterns among certain children and things like that. But for the average child, it's around 2 inches, 6.5 pounds per year. Pretty consistent growth one year to the next. Um, going to the teeth now. Babies are usually born toothless, as it says here, but within the first year, the baby teeth emerge. At about age 6, most children lose their first baby teeth. And then the molars, they eventually loosen around the ages 10 to 12 and start to come out. Yeah. So that kind of a brief look at some changes that go on in childhood. And then we get to puberty. Um, it is the physical change that occurs in adolescence, early adolescence, that makes an individual capable of sexual reproduction. So we define the changes as being either primary sex characteristics or secondary sex characteristics. The primary ones are the organs necessary for reproduction. Um, so, uh, and this is why they're considered primary, because puberty is all about becoming reproductive. Sure, there's other things that happen and other changes that go on, which are going to be in the secondary category, but the purpose why humans, as well as any other kind of mammal, goes through a puberty stage is to become reproductive. And I don't know, I guess probably even fish do it, and I have no idea, but certainly all mammals go through a puberty stage. And so we think of it in many different ways, but that is the primary purpose. So that's why the primary sex characteristics are what's necessary for reproduction. Um, the development of the primary characteristics culminates in menarche for girls and spermarchy for boys. This is the sign that you are crossing the threshold and becoming reproductive. Menarche means first menstruation. That is a sign now that this young adolescent is now ready to reproduce when a girl starts to get her period. When spermarchy means first ejaculation of sperm for a male, this is the sign that they are now becoming reproductive. So the primary characteristics that change are the primary sex organs and the reproduction system. So the ovaries mature, they're part of the primary um, sex characteristics for females. Uh, for males, it's the development of the testes and and the production of sperm. Right. Everything else, like things like, everything else is considered secondary. Things like breast development for girls. Well, you don't need breast development to have to become pregnant and have a child. I mean, so things like breast development, also the hips widen. That's going to make it easier to give birth. So there's the physical bone structure of the hips widening in females. Um, what else? As I mentioned earlier, you'll also see an increase in fat compared to males and females. Um, for males, we have the voice deepening. Their jaw will lengthen. This is another, structural change. The jaw becomes longer. Um, Hair everywhere. Okay, body hair for both males and females in various areas are secondary changes. There's probably some I'm missing, but anyways, um, and also going along with all this, and we also go through a growth spurt as well. Um, as and the growth spurt tends to um, follow menarche or spermarchy, and will kind of continue. The growth spurt kind of continues into middle adolescence. Girls reach puberty on average about 2 years before males do. Um, okay, that's enough. This is a child development course. We're going to, occasionally dip into adolescence along the way, just kind of, since we're talking about physical changes in childhood, I mean, kind of ends in puberty. So puberty is important as well. It's the end of childhood, the beginning of adolescence. So occasionally we will talk about adolescence, and we're going to do that now on the next couple of slides. There are many factors that determine the timing of puberty. You can see a list here: heredity, so your genes, your diet, health, body type, weight, racial background, um, etc. There's others as well. Uh, I'm kind of leaving that for you to read on your own. I'll mention a couple things now, but um, females tend to reach menarche, first menstruation, earlier if they're heavier. It's kind of like a sign to the body that they're ready sooner to have a pregnancy and produce a child, because they they have more mass. I don't know, I guess. Anyways, heavier is sooner. What else? Those that live more stressful childhoods tend to reach puberty earlier. So, for instance, they find that people that grow up in the city tend to reach puberty earlier than if you grew up in the country, because life is faster paced and more stressful. So stress can bring it on. Um, I don't know if I want to say anything else here. Okay. There are some racial differences as well, but anyways, I do want you to read that section on your own. Okay, precocious puberty just means early puberty. It's been reported as early as 6 or 7 years of age for some girls. I mean, ridiculous, right? I mean, I couldn't imagine my daughter at 6 or 7 going through, starting puberty. There are drugs that are available um, to push off the till later the start of puberty. So if there are signs of a girl going through very early puberty, the doctor would probably prescribe some drugs to hold it at bay until the girl reaches a reasonable age to go through puberty and become sexually reproductive. Okay, timing of puberty relative to peers can have significant impacts on development. So, like, for both males and females, there are some early developers, There are some what's called on-time developers, meaning that you're going through puberty when most of your peers are of your gender. And then there are late developers. So for females, you got the earlies, the on times, and the lates. For males, you got early, on time, and late. So you can kind of think of 6 categories. I'm not going to really talk about the on time developers. I mean, they tend to be the healthiest categories. And you go, if you kind of average time and you go through when most of your buddies are going through it, and you're not really early or late. I mean, like, it, that's obviously tends to feel good, and you don't stand out. You go through the experience at the same time as people your peers. Anyways, out of the other categories, early versus late for males or females, the most at risk considered at risk group are early developing females. So the ones that reach puberty early. And I don't mean precocious puberty. I'm not talking about 6 or 7, but just early for their group. Like they, I remember girls developing when I was 10 in grade 6 and in Canada. I mean, that's my first memory of like you know girls' bodies really changing a lot. And um, for most girls, the growth spurt and bodily changes would tend to happen um, between grade 6 and grade 8. But the ones that are doing it at the beginning of grade 6, they would be the early ones. Um, or if they do it in grade 5, that'd be early. Anyways, the reason why they're considered at risk is, first of all, remember, girls are 2 years ahead of boys to begin with. So the boys aren't even close. Any early maturing girl is going to be years ahead of any of the boys going through. So, and so like you're not just like first among girls, you're first among your whole peer group, girls and boys. The boys haven't started. So you're the early ones are going to really stand out in like when they at school and among the peer groups. I mean, and it's going to be a lot of attention placed on them. The earliest girls. It opens them up to newer experiences. Who's going to if an older male's comes around looking at I don't know at somewhat younger females, like let's say like um, a 15-year-old dating a 12-year-old or something like that. I mean, um, anyways, who are they going to pay attention to? Well, they're going to pay attention to the ones that've gone through puberty already and change. So that's one of the risk factors. It's considered a risk factor that older males may pay attention to younger females after they've gone through puberty because they now look more grown up. Um, the reason this can be bad is that it can expose them to things like early alcohol use or early drug use, early smoking behavior, things like that, early sexual behavior, um, and just because a girl's gone through puberty, it doesn't change her personality and her cognition right away. Just because of physical change that's happened. I mean, a 10-year-old is still in many ways a little girl, and so she might look. If she's an early mature, she may already look like an older teenager at 10, but she still has the mind of a child in a sense. So this the idea is that they're the earliest maturing girls often are not ready for the transition to be looked upon as being older and what comes with that. Also, many of them do not like their new bodies, so there's more chance of body issues um, because society pushes the ideal of thin. Thin is beautiful, and like yeah, all of a sudden, if you go through a body change and you have your hips widening and you're gaining more body fat. I mean, for many girls, this is where um, um, body image issues may begin is right around puberty, and they say particularly if the girl is already dating or has, some kind of romantic interest. Then their body's changing and they're scared of losing their romantic interest. I don't know what girls are doing dating at 10 to 12 anyways, but it does happen, certainly. Um, okay, so early, as far as, I'm not going to talk about the late maturing girls. They tend to do okay. Uh, as far as males, early maturing males have a number of advantages. So whereas for females it was considered kind of a risk factor to be an early maturing female, for males let's face it, you become the most popular males. I mean, like the other guys look up to you. You start growing whiskers and you shoot up and you a foot or two higher than some of the others. They often take on more leadership roles. The ones that mature early, go through puberty early. They have social benefits compared to the late maturing males. I was a late maturing male, so I kind of know a lot about this. I was a very, very late maturing male. I had my growth spurt near the end of high school, basically. Anyway, so I was the shortest in many of my grades, and I knew what it was like to feel like a shrimp and to feel like not part of the crowd. And so early early on, the early maturing boys have great advantages socially and um, mainly socially compared to the late maturing boys. What studies have found, though, is that when they compared early versus late maturing boys, and they compared them in adulthood, and I think the comparison happened sometime around like 30 or something. But anyways, what they found was that late maturing males tended to have um, more maturity and and tended to have more positive um, positive insight into themselves. They had like more well developed identities, for instance. They understood themselves better, and the reasoning why this happened, they said, is that as they went through adolescence, if they were late maturing, they probably weren't concentrating as much on social activities and dating and partying and stuff. And I can attest to that. And so they had more time for introspection and to figure out who they were and to try to better themselves in other ways. And this was when I saw this result, I thought it was very interesting and very believable as well, that there's a lot of distractions in adolescence where and as we'll see in another chapter, really one of the major um, major developments to take place is the development of your identity and who you are and learning about yourself. And I can imagine that those that develop early and had more social life probably had less time to introspect. Okay, anyways, I'm spending too much time on this. Um, Last slide for this section. And I'm sorry I'm spending too much time in adolescence, but I wanted to at least cover a few things here. So, first of all, in 2015, I'll give you a figure here. 41% of U.S. high school students reported having had sexual intercourse at least once. Okay, so that's not that surprising. 2015, 41% of high school students. So a little bit less than half. Um, well, out of this, like less than half of the teens reported having had sexual intercourse, and yet we have this tremendously high teenage pregnancy rate compared to other comparable countries. Um, you can see us once again. We're number one. Yay, we're number one. Okay, not so good. So this is between um, girls between 15 to 19-year-olds being pregnant. And you can see like we leaps and bounds ahead of these other countries here. We're number one in the world among developed countries for the teenage pregnancy rate. Um, the question then is why? Why is the U.S. teen pregnancy rate so much higher than these other countries? I'm going to give you a few reasons here, um, and there's probably others, but for one, just overall less contraceptive use and less effective contraceptive methods. There's a couple of reasons for that. Why are we using less contraceptives and less effective methods? One is that we have more poverty in our country compared to the comparable countries. The United States has a wider spread of income and living standards. I mean, we have poor, people living in poverty. We got rich people with millions of dollars, and I mean, so there's a there's a wide range. So we have more poverty, whereas other countries kind of even things out a little bit. The rich pay more taxes. It gets distributed among the poor, and so the poor get like free health care and things like that, and so there's more distribution in many of these countries. There's more distribution of wealth, so there's less people that are in poverty. There are less really rich people too, but um, there's advantages to either system, I suppose. Um, and I guess the word some people might put to that is they might call it socialism or something, that the wealth is being redistributed. But I'll tell you, growing up in Canada, I love the fact that anyone can go see a doctor there, and so a teenager is not going to think twice about seeing a doctor to check in about contraceptives and what methods they can use, and knowing that it's not going to cost them anything to go and have a doctor's visit. Um, okay, and anyways, so one thing is because of poverty, people um, often can't afford contraceptives, or they can't afford to go see doctors, or to find out about contraception or to use better methods. Also, less overall sex education in our country. Um, we have, we have good sex education in some areas, but we also have we still have a lot of real religious areas in this country. I'm going to try to watch my words here, and what we tend to find is that the sex education in more conservative religious based areas tends to be tends to lean towards abstinence rather than scientifically based knowledge about pregnancy and contraception use and things like that. Um, and all the research, there's been many research, or at least many research findings showing that abstinence teaching just does not work. It doesn't even do the one thing it's supposed to. People that go through abstinence education, sex education, compared to more scientific based sex education, they're not even less likely to have sex. The one thing is they're supposed to be doing is that they're supposed to learn to abstain, and it doesn't even do that. So basically, they're not receiving any valuable education. Okay, so that it is a shame, but we do, like, believe it or not, we have many parts of the country where there are children growing up without any kind of proper sex education. Um, and that's going and so no wonder they end up mothering or fathering a child in their adolescence. Um, okay, more barriers for contraception and or abortion services. Abortions are much easier in some of these other countries on this list here. I don't, I'm not going to argue if that's a good or a bad thing, but it's a fact. Once again, religion plays a part here. There's certain states, certain areas of the U.S. where um, contraception and abortion services um, are really seen as evil or bad, and so, like, you get people warring against Planned Parenthood and things like that. And so there are barriers that get set up, and particularly like if you're a teenager and you want, to go to a clinic or something um, to at least inquire about contraception services and or abortion services. I mean, there are barriers, and we have certain things, certain states where, at depending on your age, your parents may have to be notified, and some of these other countries just make these things easier for teenagers. Okay, and finally, I'll just say one more reason: less parental acceptance of adolescent sexuality in our country. So it's harder for U.S. adolescents to ask for advice or assistance from their parents because sex is not openly talked about in our country. We are prudish. It's kind of and it's kind of a weird mix because we are really prudish in our country about talking about sex. Families don't do much talking about sex. There are countries where it's just part of their dinner conversation about, the parents would ask the teenager, "Hey, have you had sex with your boyfriend or girlfriend yet?" Here, our teenagers would be like, "Dad, like you can't do that." Like, I mean, like it would seem like an unacceptable question, but in many countries, it is much, especially in Europe, it's much more openly talked about in families. And so it's easy for the teens to ask their parents about sexual matters because they know that they're not going to be upset about it, the fact that they might be having sex but we are prudish that way. And yet, what I was going to say is strange is that we have such a sexualized media industry, as far as the internet and movies and things like that. I mean, we have like crazy amounts of porn and that we produce and put on the internet and things like that. So, on the one hand, it's hard to watch any show or movie now without seeing some kind of sex scene if it's for adults, and so we have sex all through our media, but we're prudish to talk about it. And so so children and then teenagers grow up being exposed to it through the media, and yet having no one to turn to that is willing to be open about it. Okay, so there are a number of reasons why we are number one. You guys read about the STIs on your own, sexually transmitted infections and diseases, and that will conclude video 3.